I apologize in advance for the inevitable tears that are already starting. So, as you just heard, my grandmother passed away a month ago. In spring of 1944, she was here in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So Sippy wanted me to talk about her life as a commemoration. My grandmother's original Yiddish name was Fega Malka Gottesman, and she often went by Malchi, but when she moved to America, she took the name Margie because she liked the show My Little Margie, not to be confused with My Little Pony. Very different shows. She also loved country music and was known by some as the Country Jew. Throughout her life, she had a resilient strength and a resolve and a resolute sense of humor. She used to joke that life had given her 3 rings: an engagement ring, a marriage ring, and lots of suffering. My grandmother was born in 1928 in Kilkavnova, a small village in Czechoslovakia in the Carpathian Mountains. She had 8 siblings, 7 brothers and 1 sister. Her father, my great-grandfather, was a cattle merchant. My grandmother was told he could not afford to send her to Hebrew school with her brothers, but she persisted until he relented. Talk about being a feminist before her time. Incidentally, speaking of feminists, the last vote she would proudly cast was for one to become president. In 1939, my grandmother's village was occupied by the Hungarians. The next few years were fraught with mistreatment, but they continued to go to school into 1943. It was around then that they were forced to wear yellow stars. 2 weeks before Passover in 1944, the Hungarian police took a census so they could get a head count of whom to round up the day after Passover. The person in charge of the local police was a very nice man, and his Goyish son Peter had a crush on my grandmother. They offered to take her and her youngest brother and pretend they were part of their family, but my great-grandfather refused to let the family be separated. Thus, they all marched together 3 miles to join 50 other Jewish families in one big attic where they stayed for a month. In May, all the Jewish families were marched to a train like cattle. One morning from the train window, my grandmother saw a beautiful sunrise. She thought to herself, "Why is it so bad for us when there is such beauty in the world?" I took that moment and I turned it into a song called Sunrise, which you can find on the YouTube. After a few days, she ended up here in Auschwitz-Birkenau. They had to leave all their belongings and they were separated by gender. One kind person who was helping with the line told all the children to say they were older than they were at the risk to his own life. So even though she was only 14, my grandmother said she was 18, and when asked if she wanted to work, she said yes. However, her mother and her younger brother instead were separated out to go to the crematorium. She always regretted not being able to say goodbye. So to recap, my great-grandmother and my great-uncle were murdered here 72 years ago. My grandmother's beautiful red hair was shaved, and she and her sister were given prison dresses. It's possible her hair was on display. They slept in barrack bunk beds, 10 or 12 on one level, without room to lie down, so they had to sleep sitting up. In September 1944, my grandmother and her sister were selected to work in Essen, Germany, at a Krupp factory assembling heavy military equipment and springs for German tanks. Her sister wasn't willing to work and wanted to die, but my grandmother did both their work, even though she was beaten when they found out. In this way, she would consistently save her sister's life. Essen was bombed in March of 1945, so they were moved to Bergen-Belsen. It was there she saw 3 of her brothers through a fence. However, that joy was shortly lived because Bergen-Belsen was the worst experience by far, if possible. It was dirty, and there were wagons filled with bodies. There were lice and disease, and there was nothing to eat or drink. Yet it was clear that the Germans were losing the war, and all the Jews knew they just had to hold out a little longer. In April 15th, 1945, 3 weeks after they arrived at Bergen-Belsen, the British liberated the camp. However, by then all three of those brothers she had spotted through the fence had been killed sometime during those 3 weeks. My grandmother and her sister went to the hospital, and they both had typhus. She went to a displaced person camp in Germany for 3 years, and surprisingly and happily found out that the other 3 brothers had survived. Thus, to recap, out of 9 siblings, 5 survived. It was at this camp that she met Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, even though she didn't know who she was at the time. Speaking very gently, Eleanor gave out hairbrushes and toothpaste to all the survivors. My grandmother met her first husband at this camp and had twins, one of whom was my father. The other twin died after 6 weeks. At this point, her uncle sponsored them to move to America. They ecstatically and trepidatiously emigrated in 1949. She loved America and would be a proud American for the rest of her life. My grandmother had a second child in America, my Uncle Alex, and had what I gather was a lovely few decades in New Jersey, which was not yet the butt of New Yorkers' jokes. My grandmother was very social and really enjoyed dancing. She was always the last person to leave the dance floor at every occasion. She often lamented that she never had a childhood, so on her 50th birthday, my father's Uncle Morris gave her a doll that she cherished for the rest of her life. We gave the doll to my sister, which I think is what she would have wanted. Unfortunately, there was more tragedy to come. My biological grandfather owned a deli in Irvington, New Jersey, and one night in 1970, he was shot by robbers. My grandmother was on the phone with him when it happened. He died. And a few years later, she remarried, this time to another Holocaust survivor named David, who I will always think of as my grandfather. This is his watch. He passed away in 2012 at 92. Incidentally, David and his brother rescued 120 children and brought them through Europe to Israel, which is another story for another day. My grandmother used to talk about her life experiences whenever she was asked, and I have no idea how she did this without crying, but she did. She spoke in temples and both Hebrew and public schools. She spoke on Yom HaShoah at King University, and when she was unable to physically be there in the last few years, she would retell her story via Skype. She's also included in a few books of interviews and was interviewed in the Steven Spielberg Holocaust Archive. And there's also a 2-hour interview she gave with Kean University is available online in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's archive. And if you Google Margie Appel, it will be the only hit that's hers, as she never owned a computer. So she had no Facebook. Above all, she thought it was very important to keep her story alive, so that is what I intend to do. To that end, I am currently working on a musical about her life. One thing I will always remember is the amazing feasts my grandmother would make for all Jewish holidays. Thankfully, a few years before they became incapacitated, my grandparents taught us how to cook latkes. We made a great DVD that can be shared with our family for generations to come. She would also give me a bag of M&Ms every time I visited her, and I have made a vow to get myself some every Jewish holiday in honor of her life, and also because I'm a chocolate addict. 2 quick anecdotes. First, this high school girl in New Jersey, after hearing some survivor stories and realizing they never had a childhood, decided to organize a survivor prom. And my grandmother was on the news dancing up a storm and she had such a great time at that prom. And then second, on her 80th birthday, my grandmother was honored at her temple at Shabbat services, and she gave a speech which featured endless tangents, much like the ones I'm making, and included a random non sequitur about how she felt honored like Michael Phelps, who had just won a lot of gold medals. After her speech, she was shaking everyone's hands and thanking them for coming, and the rabbi had to actively come sit her down so they could continue the services. Watching her be that joyous will always be a highlight of my life. My grandmother was a remarkable woman who was greatly loved and respected by all who knew her. I would like to conclude with a short poem and a song. I'll always be in awe of how you lived through such a vicious threat. As the years go by, I will retell your story and I'll never forget. Your unconditional love made me who I am in each and every way, and I'm forever proud to have had you as my grandmother each and every day. Your perseverance through grave circumstances inspires me to get through all my lesser strife. Thank you for all the latkes and the constant M&Ms, and especially thank you for my life. This song was often sung to me by my grandmother in my youth. It was made famous by Dean Martin. My mother gave me a nickel to buy a pickle. I didn't buy a pickle, I bought some chewing gum. Chew, 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 chew gum. I love chew gum. Chew, 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 chew. I love chewing gum. And I love you, Grandma. Shalom.